Thank you so
So,
much.
oh, thank you. Let's just try and get comfortable wherever we are. I'm going to say, as you see, I'm sitting in my car and charging my phone, but I think I've got enough power. So try and be comfortable wherever you are. No matter where we are, we're always here. We're always with ourselves. We're always with our support system. In a practice like the homecoming, we are always with our guides, our teachers, the inspiration that brought us to practice, the beloveds who led us to this place. And from our teachers and our guides and our Buddhas, that's we learn. We learn mindfulness, breathing. We learn posture, self-awareness through music, scriptures, dharma, art, nature. The teachers and the teachings go hand in hand. And that brings us together in these communities of practice. Here we are because of Lama Rod, following the homecomings, a simple practice, 7 steps in a way to peacefulness, compassion for ourselves and all living beings. We sit in community, grateful to be together, to have friends, to have like-minded fellowship. What a blessing, wherever we are, from the campgrounds of Vermont to the streets of New York City and everywhere around the world. We can be together in this simple way. Excuse me. We come together here of our own volition and because of who we are. Those that went before us, our ancestors, whether they're family or ancestors of community or practice, the lineage of the teachers, behind us, before us, a stream, a never-ending stream of teachers, teachings, and communities of practice. This is a lineage of love and well-being and caring for ourselves and others, caring for the earth, the homecoming of the earth. Whether we sit in nature or at our kitchen table on the cushion, or maybe even laying in bed. Wherever we are, we're on earth. Thank God we have a home, a safe and grounded home. Sometimes the safety is only in our hearts and in our minds in these days of troubled thinking and disoriented cultures. But it's still earth, and she is steadfast. She is nature. The air we breathe, may it be fresh and clean. The water we drink, may it be pure and healthy. The ground we walk upon, wherever it is, we watch our steps to be careful and peaceful along the way. With every step I take, let there be peace on earth. This is a simple practice. Place now, we're reminded that we're surrounded and full of silence. Even if there's noise underneath it all, or maybe above it all, there is a silence that can be found simply by sitting and breathing, being present with our body in the posture, closing our eyes and our ears to the chaos around us and finding a place somewhere in the center between this body and the greater universal flow. There is a place of silence. Sometimes it's hard to maintain, but with practice, with these homecoming practices, we can rebalance, renew, refresh, reestablish moments of silence on the earth from the lineage of our ancestors, in community with the teachings from the teachers. All of these practices come together within us in this self, this spiritual self, maybe this Tuesday morning Sangha self. This moment of remembering who we are, of what we want to be. This homecoming we establish for ourselves here and whenever we need it. It is always with us, as are all the homecomings always with us. Breathing into the way each of us as individuals establishes the homecoming in ourselves, in our lives. I often see the homecomings in a circle, and I join my place and sit as the seventh homecoming in an ancient lineage of practice in a safe and silent way. Empowered to go forth in the day, in our world, our work, home, transit, play, love, family, knowing that we're part of the circle of the homecoming, part of this Sangha, which is by lineage and relationship, part of a larger Sangha all over the world. People are practicing homecomings. We're part of that, part of this movement of compassion and loving kindness and peace for ourselves and all living beings. Ambassadors of the homecomings that we take with us everywhere we go. Taking a few good breaths, enjoying being happy and peaceful in the knowledge that there is refuge anywhere we need it within the homecoming practice. I let it guide my day. Sometimes I forget and then I return. A few deep breaths, and we remember the teachers, the teachings, and the community of spirit and perhaps faith that we are today. And we are when we leave this circle, and we will be when we return. May you have a blessed and satisfying day. The homecoming is always here for you. And perhaps members of this group, if you need to reach out with the email for starters, probably. You're not alone. You're part of us. Be well, be wise, be kind to yourself and all living beings. And may it be so. Thanks, Cynthia and Anji.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was so beautiful.
Thank you, Valerie.
May peace be with us all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Same to you. Have a beautiful day.
Yeah.
And enjoy your trees and mountains around you, Margaret.
Thank you. I am. It's great to be outside. All
Bye.
right.